Laura, would you come and read our first lesson?
Please follow along in your bulletin if you'd like. The first lesson today comes from Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. It's a familiar story. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he couldn't see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost."
Thanks, Laura. So we're talking about meals with Jesus, and today we get a double header, lunch and dinner, both. And we, like every passage that we've looked at in this series, it's pretty exciting. The unexpected happens. Sometimes it is quiet, not too many notice, just like the servants in the kitchen at that wedding back in Cana. Other times it's a little more public, like feeding the 5,000. This time what Jesus does in both of our readings, it catches the attention of the good folks around, and it upsets them. Jesus had a way of getting in trouble and dragging other people into trouble with him. And that happens today. So our second passage comes from Matthew 9, and it is an episode where Jesus is still collecting to himself the inner circle of the 12 disciples. Beginning with verse 9 of Matthew chapter 9. Now Jesus went from there, and he saw a man named Matthew sitting in a tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. Now while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with he and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they asked the disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Well, on hearing this, Jesus said, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, it's the sick. But you go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Wow. Well, Jesus did have a reputation, even before he saw Matthew sitting in that tax booth, of hanging out with the wrong people, people of dubious reputation. Well, sometimes it was more than dubious. It was a cemented reputation of being about the wrong things. We're told in Luke 15 that both Pharisees that the scribes and the Pharisees started to complain because many tax collectors and sinners began listening to Jesus. And they say, "Look at this guy," with a bit of disgust in their voice. "He receives sinners and he eats with them." Wow. Well, why was this so offensive? Why was it offensive when he had lunch with Zacchaeus? Why was it offensive when he had dinner with Matthew and his friends? Let's look through this story, and we'll consider the major players and see what they might have been thinking. First of all, the disciples. Now, the disciples know that to hang out with Jesus is usually to get into trouble. It happened all the time. Sometimes they get stones thrown at them. Sometimes they're chased out of town. Sometimes they're accused of doing Satan's work. But I think this evening, they themselves might have been a little more uncomfortable than usual. Because first of all, Jesus calls Matthew a tax collector. The tax collectors made trouble for guys like the disciples. And when they were fishing, it took a big chunk, a big bite out of their livelihood, these tax collectors. Jesus, are you sure you want this guy on our team? Well, they go along with it. They go to dinner. But while they're eating, what happens? All of Matthew's friends show up. Other tax collectors, and more than that, sinners show up. Well, the disciples, we don't know what they're thinking. In fact, when the Pharisees ask the disciples, hey, why is your teacher doing this? We don't get an answer. They may not have had an answer. They may have shrugged their shoulders. We don't know. We're just along for the ride. And they learn to roll with it. My guess is this, that the closer we walk with Jesus, the more likely it is that we'll find ourselves in awkward and uncomfortable situations, violating the norms that are there. Well, the second group we want to look at are these Pharisees, the ones who are so upset. They're the church-going good folks, the religious ones, the ones who are doing what they should be doing, towing the line, staying on track, winning God's favor by always doing the right thing. And this offense for them, it's not just a matter of politics, because the tax collectors collected funds on behalf of Rome. It's also a matter of moral purity. My guess is the Pharisees felt disgusted. Gross. Why are you hanging out with them? These tax collectors, they don't even bother keeping themselves ritually pure, and they hang out with really disgusting people. They're with the Romans all the time. And because of their trade, they have to interact with all types of Gentiles who don't even pretend to be morally pure. This is gross. It's disgusting. You can hear them asking the disciples, how could you? How could you? Not as a question of curiosity, like, hey, help us understand what's going on here. No, I think it was disgust, like the way we say. How could you even? You know, it's early on in our human adventures that we learn how to alienate other people. Think back to elementary school. The quickest way to build your own sense of importance and belonging, or the best way maybe to hide your own insecurity, is to pick on somebody else. Call them names, preferably a name that has some type of sense of defilement or contamination tied to it. Cooties. Ralph has cooties. Well, in that simple sentence, what have you done? You've set up a social relationship in which suddenly Ralph is isolated, marginalized, alienated, even dehumanized. Jesus, don't you know they have cooties? They're contaminated, they're dirty, they're gross. How could you? How could you? I thought maybe I'd hit my horn there, maybe. Well, you know, I want to take just a note here about public discourse in our day. Have you noticed how easy it is for politicians and pundits and bloggers to resort to name calling of others, attacking the character of folks by labeling them or naming them in a way that's dismissive and dehumanizing? Barbara Walter, I mentioned her a couple weeks ago. I read this book by her about how civil wars start. And she says this, there's 4 steps to ethnic cleansing. And ethnic cleansing is when the state, with its military might, decides to just eliminate an entire class of people. She said there are 4 steps to this. The first is classification, and the second is symbolization. And that is when an identity group in power begins to highlight the differences among countries' citizens, categorizing them by groups, and adopting symbols to identify one group from the other. This is what happened when the Belgian colonizers identified in Rwanda, when they created identity cards for the previously indistinguishable Tutsi and Hutus. And then adopted certain markers for themselves, kind of like what the Nazis did when they flew the swastika or made Jews wear a yellow Star of David. You classify and then symbolize. And the stage 3 is discrimination. That is when you use the courts and the legislative branch to suppress the rights of other people. That's like what the Buddhist majority did in Myanmar when they stripped the Rohingya of their voting rights or jobs and citizenship. In stage 4 comes easily next. And it's when public discourse dehumanizes folks. That is, those in power use public discourse to turn regular citizens against the targeted minority by I'm having trouble with this word. You dehumanize them. Denigrate, that's the word I'm looking for. You denigrate them by calling them something like criminals, like the Serbs did with the Bosniaks in Croatia, or as subhuman, as the Hutsis did when they called the Tutsis cockroaches. Now, I draw attention to that because that type of discourse has become more commonplace in the world that we share. And for those of us who say we're following Jesus, a red flag should go up when we hear anyone dehumanized like that. It is not loving our neighbor to allow them to be labeled in a way that dehumanizes and marginalizes them and ultimately paves the way for violence against them. Well, the Pharisees, I think, felt moral disgust. And they allowed that disgust for them to alienate, to write off, discount an entire class of people, a class of their neighbors, whom they wanted nothing to do with. Well, let's take a look at the third set of players in this story. It's the tax collectors and the sinners. Who were they? Sinners is a vague word. I mean, it just it means anybody who's out of conformity with God's righteous law. Now, Matthew in his gospel uses this formula, tax collectors and sinners, a couple times. He also uses the phrase tax collectors and prostitutes. And it probably does extend to sexual sin like that. Now, the tax collectors, they were the ones who were benefiting by cooperation with the occupying foreign force, cooperating with Rome. It was like the Vichy in France, getting along with the Nazis. You go along to get along, right? And the tax collectors did have this reputation. It was known that they were not good Jews. They were cooperating with Rome. Now, they had multiple strikes against them. One, they collected taxes, and who likes the tax man? I don't. And secondly, those taxes were not being used for local projects. They weren't going into the public schools or patching potholes locally. They were all being siphoned back to Rome. Another reason not to like them. A third reason is because tax collectors usually were some of the best paid. And you're suspicious that they're getting fat by gouging you a little bit more. A fourth reason is they're doing all of this for the enemy, right? They're disloyal. They're not living up to helping out your own cause. So they were not liked. Matthew, he was probably a mid-level guy. How does he respond? All we know is this. He's sitting in his tax booth, doing his collection. Jesus comes by, already has a reputation. He's known as a teacher. And he calls, Matthew says, hey, follow me. So what does Matthew do? He follows him. He leaves behind his job, leaves behind his booth, probably some responsibilities there, and he follows Jesus. More than that, probably Jesus' idea, he says, we're going to have a party at your house tonight. So Matthew's feeding Jesus and his disciples. And then all of his friends come, who are more tax collectors and sinners. And what is Matthew saying? I want you to meet this guy. He has words that can turn you upside down. It happened to me. I'm leaving this whole job. I'm going to follow this Jew from Galilee. Because, man, he's got something that's real. The others come, they listen, they respond. What about Zacchaeus? Well, we know that he's a chief tax collector. That means he probably doesn't even have to do the work. He's got other folks working for him. And he makes a lot. He's probably got a reputation of having quite a bit of money, well off. Maybe the richest guy in town. Right? He's got a nice chariot with big fins on the back of it that goes really fast. Well, we're told this. Zacchaeus is curious about Jesus and he wants to get a look at him. So he does something quite undignified. He climbs up a sycamore tree so he can look. He sees him. Here's this guy. He's a bit of a, he's known in town and not liked. He doesn't mind. He climbs up a tree. He wants to see Jesus. Jesus comes out. He looks up and says, hey, man, come out of that tree because I've got to eat at your house today. I must eat at your house today. And it says this, that Zacchaeus responded with great joy. The word there, it means exceeding joy. He's like, yeah, come to my house. He's excited. He's going to receive Jesus. There's not shame, not self-consciousness. He's not shy about it. He says, come on over. I want to entertain you. I want to entertain you. More than that, Zacchaeus says this, hey, look, I'm going to do this. Right now, half of all of my wealth, 50% of everything I have, my cash and my goods, I'm going to give them away to the poor. And more than that, I know all my neighbors think that I'm a cheat. But listen, if I've cheated anybody, I'm going to pay back 4 times. Now, the Jewish law requires repayment of double. You get caught stealing, you pay back twice the amount. Zacchaeus says, I'm going to pay back 4 times the amount if I've cheated anybody. His life is turned upside down. Jesus receives these folks and they respond positively. Matthew 21 tells us this. Jesus is talking to the same Pharisees again. He says, I'll tell you what, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are entering God's kingdom ahead of you. That is, they're falling into line with God's abundant life under God's rule. Ahead of you, teachers of the law who should know better. Because when John came preaching righteousness, you didn't believe him, but these folks did. They listened and they repented. They changed their ways. They responded joyfully, expectantly, excitedly. Well, fourth, let's look at Jesus' perspective. As I've already said, he had a reputation of having a good time with the wrong people. In Matthew 11, we read this. The same folks are complaining. They say, why are you hanging out? The Son of Man, he comes eating and drinking. They say he's a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Well, Jesus had a bent towards the marginalized. The ones who were consistently given the message that they didn't belong. Jesus went out of his way to make sure they knew they did belong. Right? It's not the healthy he's come to connect with. It's the sick, the ones who need it the most. Last week he went through Samaria. It said he had to go through Samaria. He didn't have to go through Samaria. In fact, the common practice would have been to avoid Samaria. But he had to go there, and he connected with that woman and changed her life, and not only hers, but the life of her whole community that she came from. And in this passage, he sees Zacchaeus and says, I must eat at your house. I've got to come. I've got to come. When the religious teachers wonder and question, the disciples shrug, we don't know what he's doing, but Jesus turns to him and says, I'll tell you what. You guys, you say you study Scripture, you're not paying attention enough. Go back and read it again. And he points to Hosea 6. He says, go back and know what this means. Learn what this means. I desire mercy more than sacrifice. In that passage of Hebrews 6, it's pretty brilliant. Because the Pharisees are concerned about tax collectors, that is, cheats, robbers, and prostitutes. But in Hosea, the passage Jesus turns them to, it's the Jewish folks themselves who are the cheats and the prostitutes. Listen to this. This is from Hosea 6. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings. As with Adam, they've broken the covenant. They were unfaithful to me. Gilead is a city of evildoer, stained with bloody footprints. Just like marauders lie in ambush for the victims, so do the bands of priests. So do the religious leaders. They carry out their wicked schemes. They commit murder on the road to Shechem. I've seen horrible things in Israel, and Ephraim is given to prostitution. Israel's defiled. He says, you guys who think you're so smug, you think you can point the finger at those who are stealing and prostituting, but in actuality, you're guilty of the same thing. You're depriving God of what is due. You're exploiting your neighbors. You're prostituting your own hearts by not honoring God as God. Jesus does what he is such a master of doing. He turns the table around. Pretty amazing. Well, what does this mean for us? Two things, I think. The first is that we are invited to, challenged to, if we dare, to entertain Jesus. Just like Matthew. Have him at our house for a meal. We need to spend time getting to know Jesus better, being attentive to him. You know, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever your life circumstances, however deserving you feel or not, the invitation is this. Jesus is there to commune with you, to connect with you. There's this beautiful passage in Revelation chapter 3. It's written to a church in Laodicea. And Laodicea was this little town that above it was Hierapolis, which was known for its hot springs, and a little to the east was Colossae, which had these beautiful cold springs. And people would travel to these places, one for the cool, refreshing water, the other places for the hot springs that were known for healing properties. And here's Laodicea. And to the church in Laodicea, the Spirit says, you guys are so prideful. You don't know your own poverty. And so you do what? You just keep to what you've got. And you don't dare, you're not connecting with God more deeply. I wish you were hot or cold, but instead you're just lukewarm. So I spit you out of my mouth. He says this, you say you're rich, but I want this. I want you to realize how wretched and poor you are. You don't realize that you're poor and blind and naked. But I counsel you this way. Buy from me gold that is refined in fire, so that you can become rich. And get white clothes to wear so you can cover your shameful nakedness. And salve that you can put on your eyes so that you can see. I'm rebuking you this way because I love you. And I want you to know the fullness of life. It says, here I am. I'm knocking at the door of your heart. If you just hear my voice and open the door, I'll come in and do what? I'll have lunch with you. I'll come in and eat with you and you with me. It says no matter where you are, no matter how much you've taken advantage of the life that God offers us already, right now, just open the portals of your heart. Let Jesus in. I dare you this week to find even 10 minutes to sit quietly. Say, okay, Jesus, what have you got to say? Listen quietly. Imagine having a picnic with Jesus in your heart. We entertain Jesus. And secondly, we imitate Jesus. We do what he did. It's hard to engage other people the way Jesus did. It's hard to get over our preconceived ideas about who others are. It's hard to get over our disgust of people. I was thinking, who is it in my life that I'm most willing to write off as someone I would never have lunch with because they disgust me? And I was thinking, it's maybe those folks that commit atrocities, mass murders, who feed themselves a diet of hatred and distortion, who learn to hate others and then act violently and cowardly against them. You know, a couple weeks ago, David Brooks wrote this piece in the New York Times, why mass shooters do the evil that they do. It's an interesting little piece. In it, he quotes an article from Esquire 2014 by Tom Junod. And Junod is interviewing a young man who had a plan and was just about to carry out a horrific mass shooting. But the local authorities were on to him and they intervened. He pled guilty to a lesser crime, he did time, and then he came out. And Junod interviews him. Who are you? What's going on? What were you thinking about? And he says this, on the day that he set out with his armed guns and ammunition and machete, he didn't want to do it. He said, I would have turned around if someone had come to me, if they would have simply said, you don't have to do this. You don't have to have this strange strength to kill others. We accept you. He says, I would have broken down right then. If just one person had seen me and acknowledged me, I would have turned off course. Now, this same young guy, Junod asked him about Elliot Rodgers. I don't know if you remember that name, Elliot Rodgers. This was going back to 2014 near Santa Barbara, California, University of California campus in East Chula Vista. This guy killed 6 and injured 14 others. He shot them. He ran into them with his car. He used a machete on them. And this is what the young guy says, I know what he was thinking. I know what he felt. He wanted so much to be accepted. He wanted to be accepted and known that he was willing to do something drastic. And I mean this, that he had nights when he cried himself to sleep and he prayed out to God even if he didn't believe in God. Because shooters like that want to be known, not through infamy, but they want to be known before they go through the act. Oh, that's convicting to me. Folks like that I'd rather not associate with, not engaged with. You know, Jesus told a story about a good Samaritan. You know, I'll tell you a story about a good sheik, a woman, her name is Valerie Kaur. You know, when I think of folks like these guys, the kind of stuff I imagine that they read all the time, the websites that they read, the people they listen to, the lies that they fill themselves with, I think it's disgusting. It's easy for me to want to write off that crowd. Have nothing to do with them. But Valerie Kaur, the sheik, she has a commitment to try to listen to those ones who disgust her, the ones with whom she most vehemently disagrees. In Richard Rohr's daily meditation a few days ago, Mark Longhurst says this about Kaur. He says, she understands the complicated nature of listening to those that we see as our religious, cultural, and political opponents. She says it can even take a toll on somebody. Here she says, it turns out it's extremely difficult to draw close to someone you find absolutely abhorrent. How do we listen to someone when their beliefs we find disgusting, or enraging, or terrifying? We erect these invisible walls between us and them, a chasm that seems impossible to cross, and we don't even want to know why we should try to cross it. But it's in those moments that we can choose to remember that the goal of listening is not to feel empathy for the opponents or to validate their ideas or to even change their minds. Our goal is to understand them, see them. She says this, we risk also being changed by what we hear. When we really want to hear another person's story, I try to leave my preconceptions at the door and draw close. And the most critical part of listening is this, is asking, what is at stake for that other person? What is at stake? What is their fear? I try to understand them. What matters to them? Not what I think matters. And when listening gets hard, I try to just take the next breath to think of an earnest question to ask, to stay curious long enough so that I might learn. And maybe, just maybe, my opponent might listen to me, maybe understand my stories. Maybe their views will start to break apart and new horizons might open up. But then again, maybe not. It doesn't matter so long as the primary goal is to deepen my own understanding. Listening doesn't grant them legitimacy, but it grants them humanity, and it preserves my own. Wow. Grants them humanity and preserves my own. I wonder how many would-be shooters just want to be known, and if one of us, a neighbor, might be willing to listen, to swallow our disgust, to see them as a person, as one whom Jesus came to seek and to save. What a different world it might be. As we imitate Jesus, it's a risky thing, called to engage folks like that. Not to change them necessarily, not to agree with them, but to see them as humans. And maybe Jesus will change them. I encourage us all, in the world we walk in the circles we inhabit, maybe new circles that we need to form. Are there opportunities for us to entertain, to imitate Jesus by having a meal with someone whom we just can't understand? But I would suggest this. Don't try to imitate Jesus unless you have first entertained Jesus. Have your own meal with him. Learn from the master. And then on his coattails, follow after. And see if we can see even our most disgusting neighbors as humans whom God loves and who Christ died to save. Let's stand and sing together, My Hope is Built on Nothing Less. It's 4:05.